Hi everyone, so today I am going to tell you about my thesis project this year, which was measuring the effect of a disability etiquette training on UMass community attitudes. So let's start with a review of the literature. So people with disabilities face both explicit and implicit stigma and the discrimination that goes along with that. So what that means is that disabled people are often treated less favorably than non-disabled people because of their disability. And unfortunately, the stigma exists in higher education. Interestingly enough, previous studies have shown that faculty and graduate students at universities believe that ableism is a problem at their university, but don't believe they're contributing to it, whereas studies of people with disabilities at universities report that almost all of the people around them are perpetuating ableism. And in studies about disability trainings at universities, professors report that they would like to receive training, but that it is not necessarily something that they know where to find or that they believe is readily available at their university. But it's interesting to know that it's something they report wanting to learn more about. So a lot of previous disability trainings have focused on disability from like the disability services perspective. It's a lot about like what certain types of disabilities are and like the criteria for having that disability, and what accommodations a person with different types of disabilities might have, and just accommodations in general, as opposed to looking at disability as a social identity. Disability is very much a social identity, and the disability community connects the same way a lot of other minority communities connect with each other. So it's kind of interesting that no previous studies have focused on disability as an identity and just about disability in like accommodations. So previous studies have also shown that explicit disability attitudes can be positively impacted on trainings, which is good to hear, but no work exists explicitly about disability etiquette trainings, or just disability trainings in general on implicit bias. However, other work that has been done on implicit bias suggests that it's difficult to change, and can be resistant to change from something like a training. And then finally, university rank is shown to have significant differences regarding disability attitudes. So in this case, what that means is that folks who have a higher position in the university, such as faculty, are more likely to have more negative attitudes about disability. So that brings us to my study objectives. I wanted to know first, could a disability etiquette training impact explicit disability bias? And I hypothesized that it would. Second, I was wondering if a disability etiquette training would impact implicit bias, and I hypothesized that it would not. And then I wanted to know if there would be differences in the bias levels of faculty, staff, and graduate students, and I hypothesized that staff and graduate students would have less disability bias than faculty. So for my participants, I recruited staff, faculty, and graduate students from UMass. So for my materials, I used the Attitudes Towards Disabled Persons scale, which is a measure of explicit disability bias, a disability attitudes implicit association test to measure implicit bias. That's like the Harvard IAT that you can take on the internet. They're most common when it comes to talking about race, but they have them for a whole bunch of categories. A disability etiquette training that was developed by Jeffrey Edelstein and David Paquette, who are two graduate students at UMass Amherst in the College of Education. Then I had a demographics form, which importantly looked at contact with people with disabilities if participants were disabled themselves, and asked about their rank at the university amongst other demographic questions. And then There was a focus group protocol as well to ask about experiences with training, what was learned in the training, how the training can be improved, and how one can incorporate anti-ableism into their daily lives in various settings, such as at home and in the workplace. Although the focus groups have not actually been conducted yet, so I do not have the data for them. So for my procedure, I had the pre-test before participants took the training. They took an IAT and the ATDP, as well as completing the demographics form. Then they went on to take the training, which covered social identity topics and just like about disability and ableism more generally, as opposed to just looking at disability as like a service transaction at the university, which made this training a little bit different than some of the previous disability trainings. Then immediately after the training, participants took post-test 1, which had another IAT and the ATDP again. And then 2 weeks after the post-test 1 was completed, participants were contacted to take post-test 2, which was just the same measures as post-test 1, to see if participants retained information and attitudes that they might have learned about disability. Additionally, sometime after the post-tests, there will be a focus group to talk about experiences with the training and all that stuff that I covered before. It is also worth noting that in addition to the focus groups, I don't have the data for post-test 2 yet, so it is not going to be a part of my results section. So preliminary results have shown that explicit disability attitudes did not change as a result of the training. However, it's also worth noting that all of the participants knew people with disabilities and saw them on average 4 to 6 times per week, which is rather high. And 37.5% of participants did actually have prior training about disability awareness and etiquette. And it has been shown in the literature that the more time someone puts into learning about disability, the more positive their attitudes are likely to be. Regarding implicit bias, there was no significant change as expected, and there was no significant change in explicit attitudes between faculty and staff before and after the training. So overall, the attitudes toward disabled persons scores were very high, and it actually kind of makes sense because of the heavy interaction with people with disabilities and the fact that they had previous training. So even if there wasn't a significant change, the scores were still very high, although some of that could be due to the limitations that I will discuss shortly. New methods also need to probably be discovered to change implicit attitudes, as implicit attitudes, when they're negative, can affect behavior and create hostile environments for targets, and there's not really any good way of changing implicit bias that we know of right now. And university rank, as I noted before, was not significant, and I also suspect that that's because of the limitations of the study. So I think the most important limitation here is that the sample size was pretty small. I am still in the process of collecting data, so I believe I have, for this presentation, an N of 8, meaning that a lot of significant differences probably aren't going to appear, and a lot of the people who were recruited for the study were recruited through listservs such as the Alliance Against Ableism, listserv, and like College of Education and the psychology department, and these are people who are likely to be sympathetic to disability. The training also wasn't mandatory, so if you're not interested in learning more about disability and creating a more positive attitude, this was probably not a study that you were going to do. So it would be interesting to see how results would change if participants or if there was a training at one point that was mandatory to take. And finally, the sample was all from UMass Amherst. So it's not as diverse of a sample as it could be. So thank you all for taking the time to learn a little bit more about my study today. I look forward to your questions.